Joining us now to give us his opinion and legal expertise is our friend Alan Dershowitz, of course, a defense attorney, Harvard Law professor. Alan, thank you so much for coming back, sir.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, you just heard the president. He also said earlier in that press conference he just found out about it, when we all heard about it in the news. First, address the president's remarks.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry, but I didn't hear the president's remarks. I was on hold, so you have to summarize.
Oh, you didn't just hear the soundbite. I'm
No.
sorry. I just assumed that you. All right, he was
No.
outraged, and he won't tolerate it, and there's an investigation going on, and the IRS must remain neutral, et cetera. And he also said that at first he heard about it was in the news over, when we all heard about it, I guess Friday.
Well, it's a terrible allegation if it's true. I was one of those people who was audited 4 times in a row during the Nixon administration because he had his enemies list, and all 4 times I came out not owing a penny, but I had to pay a fortune to accountants to help me through my audit. The IRS is supposed to be neutral. It's never, ever supposed to be in a position to do anything but collect money. And, of course, it's a scandal if they put the thumb of politics on that scale in any way, whether it be for conservative organizations, liberal organizations, or anything else in between.
Well, and Alan, we heard on Friday that this was a offhanded admission at some kind of conference, and then the person in charge of nonprofit said, "Oh yeah, that happened during election time, but it was only in Cincinnati, a few low-level employees." And now we find out that in fact it started in March of 2010. It wasn't just groups with Tea Party or Patriot in the name; it extends now to groups opposing the government, teaching the Constitution, and Jewish groups, pro-Israel groups as well.
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems is that even if you try to be neutral and objective, if there are groups that are opposing your political view, you're more likely, unconsciously and consciously, to see them as political and partisan, and therefore to say, well, this is a political group. This is not somebody who should be tax exempt. This is a group that's taking positions. Those people who are pro-life, for example, are more likely to see somebody who takes a position that is perceived to be pro-choice as political, and the opposite is true too. Because I know some liberals have done the same thing. They've said that the Catholic Church should lose its tax exemption because it speaks out against abortion. That's absurd. I mean, they're a religious organization. They're entitled to take views on religious subjects. So I think there's both an unconscious, which is bad enough, and then a deliberate use of a kind of implicit enemies list or list harsher scrutiny of groups that are opposed to your politics. That should never be tolerated by the IRS or indeed by any branch of government. If prosecutors go after people because of their political views, and there are some instances of that happening as well, that should be obviously something that should never be tolerated.
Well, of course, as a victim, or should I say, as you described, as someone who was audited 4 times during the Nixon years, one of the articles of impeachment that would have gone against Richard Nixon was his use of the IRS to go after political enemies. In fact, George Will read that on the Sunday show on ABC yesterday. So how do you feel, when you hear about what's going on now? What should happen at the very least? I mean, doesn't someone have to be held accountable? If it's found that the White House had knowledge, is this? I mean, it certainly is an impeachable offense. Do you think that it should lead to impeachment?
Well, first of all, for it to be an impeachable offense, it can't be the White House. It has to be the person who is the president.
Right.
And that's what happened with Nixon. Nixon was found to have ordered personally, and there were tapes of it. Obviously, President Obama has completely denied that, and I'm prepared to assume that he's telling the truth. But that's not a reason for not having an investigation. And, it could be low-level people, it could be middle-level people, it could be high-level people, but for it to be an impeachable offense, it has to be the president himself, not even the vice president, not even his chief of staff.
Right. No. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Personal. It has to be personal. Yeah.
And what about the groups that have been victimized by this? What legal repercussions? What legal options do they have?
Well, first of all, they have a right to sue, and they can be compensated for any expenses that they may have incurred, and maybe even treble damages for any expenses that were incurred in trying to, in any way, send off any of these IRS inquiries. What happened in my case was after 4 in a row, I remember this is many, many years ago, but my accountant wrote when I got my fifth or my fourth, I don't remember which one, and they called it off. And they said, all right, no, we're not going to do that now. So they basically gave me an exemption from my last audit because it was clear that they had been targeting me for whatever reason. And then I found out later that targeted many, many other people like me. And, you know, in my case, I was earning a small salary. There was nothing to target, but they just were harassing. And that's, you know, that was happening in a widespread way. And what is bad for Republicans to do to Democrats is equally bad for Democrats to do to Republicans or conservatives. So I wanted to be absolutely neutral always.
Now, I don't want to throw you a curve, but I'd be remiss if I didn't
Anytime.
try to. Okay, because there's a story that's breaking on Drudge. He's got the sirens going and everything else. The Justice Department secretly obtained 2 months of telephone records of reporters and editors for the Associated Press in what the top executive of the AP is calling, quote, a massive and unprecedented intrusion into how news organizations gather news. The records obtained by Justice listed incoming and outgoing calls, the duration of each call, for the work and personal phone numbers of individual reporters, general AP office numbers in New York, Washington, Hartford, the main number for AP reporters, etc. Now, the Justice Department would not say why it sought these records, but previously, the U.S. officials have said in public that the U.S. Attorney in Washington was conducting a criminal investigation into who may have leaked information contained in an AP story about a foiled terror plot going back to Yemen. So if, in fact, that's the reason they wanted it, and if, in fact, these accusations made by the head of the AP are true, and based on you first hearing about it, based on what I said, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm very concerned about that. I mean, yes, the government has the right to investigate who might have leaked classified information, but they have to do it with a sensitivity toward the First Amendment rights not only of newspapers and of news gathering sources, but also of the readers. I mean, there's a Supreme Court decision in the Stanford University newspaper case which basically says the same rules don't apply to newspapers as apply to ordinary businesses. The parameters of the First Amendment extend to the business of news gathering differently than they do to other businesses. And so I'm very concerned about that. Obviously, I want to find out more about it, what the justification is. But there's almost never a justification for pervasive monitoring of how journalists gather news. They have to have much more precise targeting of particular leaks. So I'm concerned about it.
And the letter notified the AP, was received by the AP from the Justice Department, says it offered no explanation for the seizure. So that's the latest.
Well,
but the speculation.
There should be hearings and an inquiry as to what basis they had and why they had to go so broadly, whether it could have been done more narrowly. When you're dealing with freedom of the press, you have to be very, very delicate. You can't use a blunderbuss. You have to use a surgical knife.
I hear you. Mr. Dershowitz, as always, sir, a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. Alan Dershowitz, ladies and gentlemen.